Okay, so I need to tell you something. There were two separate news stories this week, but I think they're actually one story. One was happening in the Middle East. American warships, Iranian ports, a blockade. The Strait of Hormuz basically shut down. And the other? Way on the other side of the world. A tiny disputed fishing spot in the South China Sea called Scarborough Shoal. A floating barrier, 352 meters long, stretched across the entrance. Chinese Coast Guard ships surrounding it. Filipino fishermen turned away. On the surface, these look like two totally unrelated news stories. Different oceans, different countries, different crises, right? But here's the thing, and this is exactly what I want to talk to you about today. They're not separate at all. What if I told you the war in the Middle East and that barrier in the South China Sea are connected? Would that surprise you? Because here's the real question. When a war starts somewhere, does it actually stay there? Or does it travel to places you least expect? Let's start with the barrier. Scarborough Shoal, Bajo de Mazinloc to the Philippines, sits just about 120 nautical miles from the Philippine coastline. It's a traditional fishing ground. Generations of Filipino fishermen have made their living there. It's entirely inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. But China also claims it. And in 2012, after a tense standoff with the Philippine Navy, China just took control and never left. Chinese Coast Guard and fishing vessels have patrolled there ever since, pushing Filipino boats away. The tension never went away. Not once. Then on April 10th and 11, 2026, satellite images from Vantor showed something new. A floating barrier stretched across the shoal's only entrance. Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson Jay Terriella confirmed it. 6 Chinese maritime militia vessels inside the shoal, 3 more blocking the entrance outside. Think about that for a second. Not just boats circling. This is a physical barrier. A door being closed on water that isn't theirs to close. The Philippines has cut these barriers before. Each time a new one goes up, the message from Beijing gets a little bit louder and bolder. And last year, China did something that alarmed Philippine officials even more. It declared a national nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal. Philippine security officials called it a clear pretext for occupation. That's a very blunt thing to say out loud in diplomatic language. A 2016 international tribunal, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, ruled in Manila's favor. It said China's blockade there violates international law. China rejected that ruling completely. Didn't show up, didn't acknowledge it. Just kept operating as if the ruling never happened, as if it didn't exist. So by April 2026, one floating barrier, 10 Chinese Coast Guard vessels spotted in 8 days, Filipino fishermen blocked from their own traditional waters. Here's what I want you to think about. Why April? Why this particular week? What exactly was happening in the rest of the world right then? At the exact same time, literally the same week, the U.S., Australia, and the Philippines were running joint military exercises in the South China Sea. April 9 to 12. Filipino FA-50 fighter jets, Australian P-8A Poseidon surveillance aircraft, the USS Ashland, a U.S. Navy dock landing ship. This was already their second joint maritime drill in the South China Sea in 2026 alone. The year wasn't even halfway through. Second time already. Right behind it, the annual Balikatan exercises. The word means shoulder to shoulder in Filipino. Were set to begin April 20th. Over 17,000 troops. Philippines, the U.S., Japan, Australia, Canada, France, New Zealand. All together. One of the largest exercises ever held in the region. Japan wasn't just an observer this year. For the very first time, Japan's self-defense forces would fire missiles live, actually shooting during the exercises. The U.S. military spokesperson called it an ironclad alliance. When diplomats reach for words like ironclad during a crisis, pay very close attention. Here's an interesting detail. France sent just 15 to 20 troops instead of 150. Why? They'd rerouted their naval deployment back to Europe for the Middle East crisis. Even France had to choose. Middle East or Indo-Pacific? That's the kind of impossible triage that happens when military assets are genuinely stretched thin. So you had China installing a barrier while Allied forces were drilling just offshore. Same week, same ocean. Does that feel like a coincidence to you? The U.S. spokesperson was explicit. These drills demonstrate America's commitment to the Indo-Pacific, even as global attention remains fixed on the Middle East. That word even is doing a lot of work there. It acknowledges the distraction. It's basically saying, yes, we're pulled elsewhere, but we haven't left. There's also a structural shift happening underneath all this. Japan and the Philippines signed a reciprocal access agreement in 2024. A new defense web forming, March 26th. The Philippines signed a military deal with France, too. Country by country, link by link, quietly and systematically. While everyone watches the Middle East, by April 2026, that one patch of ocean held simultaneously a Chinese barrier, Allied war games, Japanese live fire drills, and Filipino fishermen trying to do their jobs. Multiple storylines, same water, same week. Now let me tell you what was happening on the other side of the world. The thing that made all of this click. February 28, 2026, U.S. and Israeli forces launched strikes against Iran. That's when it all began. 6 weeks of war and the world tilted on its axis. Within days, Iran's Revolutionary Guard made an announcement that sent shockwaves through global markets. Any ship trying to cross the Strait of Hormuz will be attacked. Do you actually know what the Strait of Hormuz is? It's a narrow channel, about 33 kilometers at its tightest point, between Iran and Oman. And through that tiny bottleneck flows roughly 20% of all global oil and gas. 1/5 of the entire world's energy supply through a channel barely wider than a river. When Iran threatened to close it, ship traffic collapsed. Oil prices surged. Brent crude climbed from around $70 a barrel before the war to nearly $100. Think about what that means in your daily life. Every gas station, every cargo ship, every grocery store shelf, every delivery, all of it touched by that one strait. Japan has 250 days of oil in strategic storage and started tapping it. South Korea scrambled to find 273 million barrels through routes completely bypassing Hormuz. Over 80% of the oil and gas flowing through Hormuz goes to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, South Korea. That's where the pain hits the fastest. China is exposed too. Analysts estimate China has over 100 days of stockpiled oil, but no one knows for sure because Beijing doesn't publish that data. So Asia is holding its breath, worried about energy, supply chains, food prices, while the U.S. military is deeply committed to the Middle East theater. By March 20th, the U.S. deployed the USS Boxer and additional Marines to the region, on top of 50,000 troops already stationed in the Middle East. The USS Abraham Lincoln, an aircraft carrier, had been pulled from the Asia-Pacific to the Middle East back in January. That's a massive shift in capability. A bipartisan group of U.S. senators visited Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. They heard direct, worried conversations about missile defense systems and Marine units being pulled away. Senator Shaheen came back and said, bluntly, failure is not an option. Asian leaders told her the Iran war is directly reshaping their security calculations. Even NATO's Secretary General said it publicly. A conflict over Taiwan likely won't stay confined to the Indo-Pacific. China could activate partners elsewhere to divert U.S. attention. Now flip to China's position. They publicly criticized the Hormuz blockade. Wang Yi called it against international interests. Urged restraint from all sides. But here's the structural reality beneath the diplomatic language. Every U.S. warship in the Persian Gulf is one warship not patrolling the South China Sea. Every missile defense system moved to the Middle East is a gap in Asia. Every delayed arms delivery to Taiwan is a window of uncertainty opening up. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's just math. Military assets are finite, attention is finite, and everyone in the region is doing the exact same calculation. So when a 352-meter barrier goes up at Scarborough Shoal the same week, Hormuz is in crisis and Allied troops are drilling nearby, you see something bigger. Now let me put this in perspective, because you might be thinking, hasn't the world always worked this way? Don't wars always have ripple effects? Yes and no. Let's go back a bit. Even the Cold War, and that 40-year global standoff between the U.S. and Soviet Union, had real limits. The Cold War was a genuinely global competition. From Berlin to Angola to Vietnam to Cuba, the entire planet organized into two opposing camps. But here's the key. The actual fighting was mostly contained. Limited wars in limited places. The superpowers clashed through proxies, not directly against each other. The Cold War, as historians describe it, was waged mainly on political, economic, and propaganda fronts. with only limited actual use of military force. Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan. Devastating conflicts, yes. But the direct superpower clash, the nuclear standoff, held back by the logic of deterrence. The world was connected, but the connection had lagged time. More friction. A war in Korea didn't immediately redeploy assets from Europe. The system was slower. Today, the connection is immediate, real-time. A carrier group moves in the Indian Ocean, and analysts in Beijing, Manila, and Seoul are recalculating within hours. Modern warfare isn't just where the bombs are falling. It's the entire map of pressure, assets, alliances, and signals surrounding the actual fighting. You don't need to fire a single shot in the South China Sea to change the strategic math there. You just need the right move somewhere else. This is what experts mean by multi-theater conflict. NATO's Secretary General said it himself. Nothing stays confined to one region anymore, not in this world. The battlefield gets narrower. But the strategic map, where decisions are made, where pressure is applied, where alliances are tested, that gets wider and wider. Think of it this way. The war is happening in one room, but the temperature in every other room in the house is changing at the same time. So the question isn't just where the fighting is. The real question is, which other rooms just got colder? So let's bring this all back together. April 2026. Middle East on fire. Hormuz blockade. U.S. military assets stretched across two oceans. Global oil prices spiking. And in the South China Sea, a 352-meter floating barrier goes up. Allied nations drill together at the largest scale ever. Japan fires missiles in live exercises. Each of these events has its own story, its own history, its own set of causes. But they're all unfolding inside the same strategic moment. Here's what I keep coming back to. No one had to give a single order connecting these events. The connection is structural, built into the system itself. When one part of the global security architecture is stressed, every other part responds, not through conspiracy, but through pure calculation. Everyone is watching everyone. That's what makes modern warfare so different. And honestly, so hard to explain in a 5-minute news segment. The action is local. The pressure is global. A 352-meter barrier on a remote shoal becomes a test of alliance credibility, of American attention, of Chinese resolve, all at exactly the same moment. Filipino fishermen trying to reach their traditional waters aren't caught in two separate crises. They're caught in one very large, very connected world. And here's my question for you. We're used to understanding war by watching where the bombs fall. But what if that's not actually where the war lives? What if the real war, the one that shapes the next decade, is being fought in the space between the stories? In the gaps, signals, and quiet moves. Modern war doesn't stay in one place. It travels. It finds the open windows. It moves through energy markets, alliance networks, and disputed fishing grounds. The guns might be firing in one ocean, but the order of the world and who controls what, who goes where, who fishes where, is being rewritten everywhere, all at once. That's a wrap for today. The war may start somewhere specific, but in today's world, it never, ever stays there.